And I think that it must have been a very traumatizing day for them. We had asked if we couldn't please, after we picked up Bashar's papers and books, he's an engineering student, and his dorm room was completely destroyed, all kinds of broken glass and piles around the room. But we managed to salvage, really, I think, most of his books and some of his papers. Then we went to the Shifa Hospital, a central hospital in Gaza City. And I happened to meet a guy who grew up in Chicago, on the streets of Chicago in the Lakeview neighborhood, Dr. Saeed Abu Hassan. And he was an ICU ER doctor who lived in the Emirates but had decided to respond to a call for emergency help. And so I asked him, after he talked a little bit about his experiences, what do you think is the most important thing for me to say to people back in the United States? And he started to say, well, you see so many people, they need prostheses now, and they need rehabilitation clinics, because these bombs, they are very new for us. And I think he was referring to the dense, inert metal explosion bombs, and the doctors can't find shrapnel to take out of the body that's been hit by one of these bombs, because the bombs lacerate the limb above the joint. It's just such a forceful explosion. And then he said, no, wait. Yeah, you go back to Chicago, just you tell the people this. American money paid for these weapons. Well, I was so impressed with Dr. Nafis Abu Shebhem, because as he was trying to talk to us, he took a call that happened to come in from a farmer who lived in the area of Tufa, the northern part of the Gaza Strip. But the roads were working properly. You could drive the whole strip in 35 minutes. It's not, it's a very, 1.5 million people are very densely populating the strip, but it's not a long strip. Anyway, I was impressed that he took this phone call and he was listening so carefully, and we couldn't help but eavesdrop. And the person at the other end was a farmer. And the farmer lived in an area where the Israeli Defense Forces had crossed in with a land invasion using Caterpillar D9 bulldozers. And our friend Audrey had just come back from there. It was quite a coincidence. And she had been telling me and showing me pictures on her cell phone that the Israelis had first communicated that people should excavate the homes. Evacuate the homes. And then they dynamited every single house along the border, so that as far as Audrey could see in either direction, it was all rubble. And then the bulldozers came across and they ripped up all of the orange trees. Entire groves of orange trees ripped up. And so the farmer, calling Dr. Nafis Abu Shebhem, wanted to know, could they at least salvage some of the oranges? But the workers, when they would pick up the oranges, would find that very soon their hands were itching. And the oranges had a foul smell. And was it all right in the eyes of the doctor to try to salvage these oranges? And we watched the doctor put his head in his hands. And he said, just you wash them very, very carefully, and then you be careful. We don't know all what was used against us. And then he told us that what they did know is that this attack had been worse than an earthquake. He said, and he was really shaking, that after an earthquake, people send help. They send relief. They feel remorse. But in the eyes of the Gaza people, what they were seeing was that, in fact, the United States and Israel were already trying to figure out how to bring NATO in to tighten the thumbscrews of the blockade. They knew that there were trucks in parking lots with medicines that were expiring and food that was molding, that wasn't being allowed to come into them, and they couldn't get people out unless they waited sometimes for hours or days. The frustration and the rage was so high for these doctors. And then one of them started to tell us about how when they had tried to work on patients who'd been hit by white phosphorus, they would remove what they call necrotic tissue, blackened, ashy tissue. They'd remove it and go to work on another part of the patient's body, and then discover that the tissue was burning again, because the white phosphorus, when it's exposed to oxygen, starts to oxidize, starts to burn again, and this was causing fumes. So that Dr. Saeed Abu Hassan's first really connection with the United States, the place of his birth, was to be breathing the fumes of the white phosphorus as he was trying to remove it from patients' bodies. And he said, really, our lungs would become too full and we couldn't continue. So Dr. Nafis Abu Shamham took us to visit a woman named Saba Abu Halimi. And her arm was wrapped with bandages from the shoulder to the wrist. It looked almost like a hive. And I'm sure she must have been in considerable pain, but at least she could survive. They'd been able to remove enough of the white phosphorus, and she was recovering in their hospital. She wasn't going to be sent on. But what really was causing her great pain, enormous grief, was the memory of what had happened on January 4th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And as I listened to her, I thought, well, maybe she's on medication, and some of this is nightmare. Maybe it's not all really true. So after we said goodbye to her, after she sobbed in my arms and she said, where will I go? What will I do? I asked Nabil if we couldn't try to find her house in Al-Atatra, a small village up near the north, near Beit Lahia. And so driving along roads that were so damaged, it took a long time, but after about 3 or 4 hours, we actually did manage to go to her house, because we kept saying we wanted to go to the house of Sadallah, who was her husband who had been killed. And people knew this story, and so we went inside the house and we could see plenty to corroborate her story. I still don't know all of the pieces, but we gave her information and her son's phone number to Sabrina Tavernus from the New York Times. And I really admire this woman because she kept piecing together the story that became a front page story that I read when I came back. And I'll just share this with you from the February 3rd edition of the New York Times. The phosphorus smoke bomb punched through the roof in exactly the spot where much of the family had taken refuge, the upstairs hall, away from the windows. The bomb, which international experts identified as phosphorus by its fragments, was intended to mask troop movements outside. Instead, it breathed its storm of fire and smoke inside Saba Abu Halima's hallway, releasing flaming chemicals that clung to her husband, her baby girl, and 3 other small children, burning them to death. Saba Abu Halimi's son, Adnan, showed us the charred room that was blackened where they had all huddled. It was the smartest place to go when they heard the bombing because there was only a tiny little window. And then he showed us that the Israeli Defense Forces had actually occupied that particular house. And written on the wall were the words in Arabic, Min Jesh Israelim, from the Israeli army, Nahnu Nsifa, we're sorry. And I want to believe that those words were written sincerely. It's maybe something a bit unusual about my life, but I had been in the Jenin camp in Israel's West Bank in 2002, in April. And it happened that at that time, Israeli Defense Forces had surrounded that camp, and 103-story buildings had been completely destroyed. And we had been told, in the most friendly of ways, really, by numerous Israeli soldiers, as 5 of us tried to enter that camp, every time we came to a checkpoint, people assured us, there are no people in the camp, there's only terrorists, there are no women and children in that camp. And then we said, then good, let us go in. And we had a white pillowcase tied onto a broom pole. And it was kind of like a Monty Python scene. Eventually, after we talked about scripture or pop music or different novels we read, these mostly young Israeli soldiers would eventually warm up to us. And often they'd say, look, I'm not responsible. I'm only doing my job. And then we'd see an older soldier hear that and kind of wince, knowing that those same words were articulated by Adolf Eichmann in the Eichmann trials, but they'd say, yeah, all right, just go 2 onion fields down and turn when the tomato crops. And we, okay, sure. We got inside the Jenin camp. The first thing we heard were the moans of an older woman, a grandmother. She was paralyzed from the waist down. Her family was trying to feed her out through an aperture of a home that was partially collapsed. It was too dangerous for the family to come out. News people came by in the back end of a pickup truck and they started to film what was happening, and all of a sudden sniper shots blasted through the air. The news people were gone within seconds, And what could we do? We tried to receive this older woman.